Good morning, everybody. My name is Aalen. I'm a senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute, and I'm very happy to open this series of seminars on China-Africa relations. Over the past 10, 15, 20 years, the world has changed quite dramatically with both in international economy and international relations. Power and influence is shifting from the north and the west to the south and the east. And a key factor here is the role of China, which has become a very influential and powerful actor also on the African continent. And it's visible in statistics showing trade figures, investment, provision of development finance, and in development assistance. It is visible in politics with frequent, very high-level visits between China and Africa. And it's very visible in the number of Chinese migrants and workers finding their place in Africa, but also in a large and very dramatically increasing number of Africans going to China for studies and training courses. In this series of 6 seminars, we will look into a number of dimensions of this. China's role in Africa's industrial development. We will look at the current debt situation. We will look at China's role as a provider of development aid and how that impacts on the global and Western-dominated aid architecture. We will examine China's role in fisheries, and we will examine China's role in relations to regional institutions in Africa. And finally, at the end of the seminars, we will also take a step back and look at what shapes China's Africa policy and what place Africa occupies in China's foreign and development policy. But the first seminar today is on industrial development and the case of Ethiopia. If you look at trade figures, the trade between China and Africa is very much the traditional north-south pattern, export of raw materials from Africa, import of processed and manufactured goods from China. But things are also happening that may change this, with China also playing a role in industrial development in Africa. That's what we zoom in on today. And then I hand over to Lovise, my colleague and senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute, and she will take us through the seminar.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. As Aalen mentioned, I am a senior researcher at CMI. I have been following politics at the Horn of Africa for about 20 years. I'm currently leading research projects following female factory workers in the new industries in Ethiopia. And many of these industries are funded and operated by China or Chinese investors. Today, I'm going to just briefly introduce Ethiopia and China collaboration when it comes to industrialization. And then I'm going to introduce the panelists. We have 3 panelists taking part in this webinar. And all of them are going to have their presentations, and then we'll finally have a discussion, and there will be a chance for you as an audience to ask questions, preferably in the chat. So the seminar will be starting now and end at 10 o'clock. That means after approximately 1.5 hours, 10 o'clock local time. So I will just start by talking about Ethiopia and about Ethiopia's role in the big picture of Chinese aid and investment in Africa. Ethiopia is, as you may know, the 2nd most populous country in Africa. It has a population of around 100 million people. It is not a particularly attractive trade partner originally because it's landlocked. It doesn't have the minerals as many other African countries have. So as a starting point, it wouldn't be a very interesting partner for China. We know that normally China would go for both aid and investments in countries which has raw materials that is useful for China's development. But Ethiopia doesn't really have that. So why is Ethiopia an attractive partner for China? It has been since in the period from 2000 to 2014, the second largest recipient of Chinese aid. Of course, it's difficult to know exactly the size of aid from China to Africa because there is mixture of investment and aid, and it's not always easy to distinguish what actually is simply aid and not investment loans, grants, and etc. But Ethiopia has been a very important partner, both in investment and aid. So why is it interesting for China to collaborate with Ethiopia? There could be a political reason. Ethiopia has been committed to a developmental state model where the state should play a big role in the economy, should facilitate development and have a clear agenda of what it would like the private investors to invest in. It has had a close political connection with China. There have been exchanges between the Communist Party and the ruling Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front that was in power from 1991 to 2018. And there have been frequent visits between the state leaders in the two countries, especially since the mid-2000s, 2005 and onwards. And of course, Ethiopia, as a big country, has a youthful population. It has abundance of labor, a large young population. And up to now, many of them have been living in the countryside. So there has been, there is a reservoir of labor that can be transformed from agriculture to the industries. And as a consequence of abundance of labor, the cost of labor is cheap. It's low. There are very different figures on how low the labor costs are, varying from half of what it is in China to 1/5 of what it is in China. It's not always easy to know exactly what it is, but it is low. And when you ask Chinese investors why they come to Ethiopia, they would also say that they could, by relocating low and less environmentally friendly manufacturers abroad, that could facilitate an economic upgrade and reduce environmental pollution in China. So that's also an interesting part of this picture. Of course, a bit sad for Ethiopia. Another attraction with collaborating with Ethiopia is that Ethiopia has negotiated tariff-free access to Europe and the US. So by producing in Ethiopia, China will also have access to these markets. And of course, Ethiopia and Africa is a big market for Chinese goods. Another aspect also of making Ethiopia an interesting trade and development partner is that Ethiopia is centrally located in the political landscape of Africa. It is the capital, the diplomatic capital of Africa, hosting the African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa, and is also central in the regional IGAD. So it could be a very important entry point for China's more political role on the African continent as well. If you look at the broader picture, of course, the three speakers here will go into the more details of the different aspects of it. But if you look at the broader picture and what has been, coming out of this collaboration, of course, thousands of jobs have been created in the industrial parks where China has been instrumental in developing. But the export, for example, the trade balance is quite favorable towards China. The export of Ethiopian goods to China is quite minimal, while the export of Chinese goods to Ethiopia has increased steadily over the years. Of course, this is counterbalanced by developing learning institutions and having aid projects in Ethiopia. There are several, as Aalen mentioned, several thousands of Ethiopian students going to China to learn. And many bureaucrats and political officials have been going for training to China. So there is some balance here. Lately, we can say that there have been challenges to this quite, at least apparently, harmonious collaboration between China and Ethiopia. After the political change in Ethiopia in 2018, where the former TPLF government was ousted by the government of Abiy Ahmed, there have been less certainty in the kind of friendly relationship between the two countries. Abiy Ahmed wanted to liberalize the economy more. He has turned towards Western donors and also towards the Middle East, to the United Arab Emirates. And maybe most important of all, the war or the internal conflict between the central government of Abiy Ahmed and the former power holders in Tigray since November 2020 has questioned the kind of predictability and stability of Ethiopia. So this may question future increase in aid and investment in Ethiopia. But that will be also interesting for me to hear from the others, how they would think about this. Because we know that China has maybe has a bigger will than other donors and investors to engage in politically risky countries. So maybe it doesn't have as much consequence as we would think. So I'm going to introduce the three panelists. I'm very happy to have three panelists from different places around the world who all have an interest in Chinese aid investment and also in Ethiopia. We have Yu Zheng, who is professor at the Fudan University in international relations and public affairs. He has done research, interesting research on Chinese aid to Africa particularly, and also the relationship between aid and investment. And today he will speak about China's development assistance to industrialization, the larger patterns and maybe also aims, and maybe also investment in industrial parks. Then we have Gedion Jalata from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He is a researcher at the Forum for Social Studies. It's a think tank in Addis Ababa. And he's also a PhD fellow at Pretoria University. He has written on non-Western aid to Ethiopia, comparing India and China. And he's also discussing the kind of Beijing consensus compared to the Washington consensus. What kind of difference, what's the nature of Chinese and Indian aid compared to Western aid? He will speak about Ethiopian industrialization plans and the China's role in that today. And then finally, we have Nicolas Lepones. He is a doctoral candidate in politics at Oxford University and also a researcher at the Center for the Study of African Economies. And he has also done research in Ethiopia, focusing on politics of industrial policy, also in Angola, I think. And he will today speak about urbanization and industrialization in southern Ethiopia, in Hawasa, which is a main industrial park and the sort of flagship industrial park in Ethiopia. So let's start with you. Let's hear about China's assistance to industrialization.
Turn on my microphone. Well, thank you very much, Lovise and Aalen, for inviting me to this very interesting panel on China's role in Africa's industrial development in the case of the Ethiopia. Yeah, I think can I share my screen so I can actually have a few PowerPoints? So I think I can. Where should I share? I think I don't see this option here.
So we just have to make you a co-host, I think.
Yeah, I think you can also do it by if you're the host, going to share screen and you allow.
Now you are a co-host.
I'm not host. Okay, I'm a host now. I don't think I got this. Sorry, I think I'm a little bit. No, I didn't. Sorry, I didn't find there's any option I can share the screen.
There's at the bottom. If you put your mouse at the bottom line.
I did, but I couldn't.
It's
find
in
it.
between chat and raise hand.
I couldn't even find it. There's a raise hands, button here. I think there's a chat button, but I think it's. Oh yeah, there's a chat. No, but I don't see there's any. Sorry, I think I probably didn't get this. Well, I think I'm just gonna talk. Well, hopefully I think it's I can do this later. So I'm gonna talk about China's role in Ethiopia's industrial developments. Well, I think the first thing I think is China's has been engaged with Ethiopia since the beginning of the 21st century through China now is Africa's largest trading partner, and also the main aid provider, and also the one of the largest investors, and also largest lenders. So I think that's the we basically see this this troika of the aid and the loans and investment from China going to Africa, and also I think it's China's the development cooperation model, which if we call this, it's different from what we traditionally see the Western countries been doing. It's actually was not just about aid. It's actually combined the I call it 3I investments, infrastructure and industrialization. So it's a it's a triangle. It's a China's development cooperation to Africa, and one of the key part of this, the China's development cooperation with Africa is actually engaging this investment in special economic zones in Africa. So I think it's according to we have done some collection about the China's activities of the SCZs in Africa. In total, I think there are about around like 70 SCZs, which was China has invested or either independently or is actually partnered with the African governments. So in Ethiopia, which is I think it's China has the which has more SEZs than any other African countries. There are in total there's 22 SEZs in Ethiopia, and 12 of them were invested or constructed by the Chinese investors. So so I think it's clearly, I think it's Ethiopia is the major partners of China in Africa, in the whole African continent. So I think there's one question we think about this. The African is trying to develop its industrial strategy, achieve this industrialization. And China it's actually as one of the in the past 30 years as the main, it's the industrial powerhouse, in the world. So they have been experienced this transition. So whether this transition from this made in China could smoothly become, to the made in Africa, I think there's a big challenge, because you see from in the last 20 years, China's the share of this manufacturing outputs of the world has steadily increased. Now it's almost over a quarter of the world total industrial outputs. But in the same time, we actually see Africa, despite the efforts that they were trying to achieve its own industrial developments, the share of this Africans industrial outputs has actually declined. So this actually has raised some concern that whether whether this China's aids or investment could actually really help promote help the African to promote its industrial development. So I think this is something I want to just talk a little bit about in this my presentation. I think it's the question: can China's economic transformation benefit Africa's industrialization? So there could be two different scenarios as we see that. There could be one. There could be some. It's called a competitive scenarios. That means the imports from China could actually create this competition pressure, which displays African products and also make African lose some market share. But there is also a complementary scenarios, which could be the exports from African to China would actually boost African producers, and participating in this global value chains with China would also increase Africans' global market share. So there could be two different scenarios, when this kind of get between African and China. So how can we, evaluate whether, which scenarios would actually apply to this China-African relations? So I think it's, I did a little bit, just data analysis. I hope I can share this, the screen with you. But I think it's if you look at, what's happened between China and Ethiopia since 2000, we actually see this imports from China as a proportion of the total, the Ethiopia's manufacturing outputs has increased by, more than I think it's has increased more than 200 times by some calculation. That's the inputs from China was actually even twice as large as Ethiopia's own manufacturing value added. So that's a huge increase. But in the same time, we also see that Ethiopia has experienced an increase of its manufacturing outputs, and also as well as its the job creation. So this positive correlation could also indicate that China's the trade with China could actually has could potentially benefits the Ethiopia's industrial production. However, but in recent times, we saw there's some research, recent research by the one of the co-author, which is, I think is Danny Roderick, has showed that Ethiopia has actually and also another country is that Tanzania has experienced this manufacturing puzzle, which is that on the one hand, they have one of the best performing economies in Africa, but in the same time, the manufacturing has played a very marginal role in employment creation, exports, and outputs, and they couldn't actually stimulate the domestic linkage. So that means, manufacturing, despite the strong economic growth, the manufacturing hasn't really played a big role in contribute to this economic growth. So one possible explanation is that, by participating in this global value chain would actually has forced some low-income countries such as Ethiopia to adopt more advanced technology than it's supposed to do, and they give up their comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing. So we actually see that means Ethiopia could actually its manufacturing has not created enough jobs as it supposed to, because it's actually it's not actually creates enough job in this labor-intensive manufacturing. Okay, so my last point is, can Ethiopia achieve the sustainable economic, industrial development? So I think is my first, thought is actually in general, I think it's China and Ethiopia has a complementary economic relationship, which I think fits into the second, scenarios as I just described before, that because Ethiopia's industrial structure and the development levels are very different from China's. So Ethiopia is likely to benefit from this industrial capacity cooperation with China. As a matter of fact, you see that the Chinese investments into the Ethiopia for the last 20 years, manufacturing accounted for more than 70% of the Chinese investment projects, over the last 20 years, which means I think it is manufacturing. It is the top priority of the China, destination for the Chinese investments. However, I think as we see that Ethiopia's own industrialization patterns won't be able to mimic the Chinese experience, which I think it's, I think it's for relative reasons. I think it's the change of the globalization and also the global value chain, which has made it very difficult to copy this, to replicate this Chinese model of the industrial developments. So I think I'm going to stop here. I hope I can, maybe if I can figure out a way to share the screen, I will do that later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And sorry about the technical problems, but you managed to convey your message very well without the slides as well. I will give the word to Gedion. You ready? So you have to unmute as well. We don't hear you.
Okay, now I see I can share the screen, but I think the button didn't come, before.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but I think I'll do that later. So I think.
Okay, let's get back to that. I'm promising.
Sorry about that.
Get back to that.
Yeah.
And you're on now, Gedion.
Okay, I hope you
Yes.
are listening to me, all of you now.
Oh, yes, we are.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. Sorry, I was unable to talk to you during the chat before the meeting.
You are here now. That's the most important.
I'm back now. Thank you for the privilege extended to me. So I will briefly speak on Ethiopia's industrialization, plans and achievement, and the role of China. So in my presentation, I would like to highlight 4 important points. Number one, what are the contexts, the broader context which led Ethiopia to embark on industrialization and the industrial parks development. In my second part of presentation, I would like to highlight about policy and the practice of industrial park development in Ethiopia, because by far the government is driving the industrialization agenda through industrial park development. And also I will try to highlight briefly the associated opportunities and challenges in relation to industrialization as well as industrial parks in Ethiopia. And finally, I will highlight about the role of China in industrialization agenda of Ethiopia. So as a context, as highlighted by the previous speakers, Ethiopia's economy has been remarkably growing on average by 11% per annum in the last 12 years. And underpinning this growth, the expansion in the agriculture and the service sector is critical, accounting for about 41% and 45% of the GDP in value-added terms. However, the contribution of the industrial sector to GDP, on the other hand, remained below 40%. So there has been a sluggish industrial sector development overall against agriculture and service sector. And notwithstanding the remarkable spur of economic growth, there has been limited growth in the industrial sector, suggesting a slow pace of industrialization and the structural transformation over the last decade. So against this background, the lessons from successful countries, including China, shows that industrial parks have been a principal policy instrument in enhancing economic transformation. So Ethiopia considers industrial park development one of the primary policy tools for industrialization. And in this regard, the country has taken necessary measures, including formulation of industrial park proclamation, establishing regulatory and implementing organs such as the Investment Board, Ethiopian Investment Commission, Industrial Park Development Corporations. Not only Ethiopia instituted these institutions, Ethiopia also embarked on different industrial park developments. As you all know, after the 2006 FOCAC commitment, China helped to build the first industrial park in Ethiopia since 2010, which I have been closely following. That is the Eastern Industrial Park. And the experience at Eastern Industrial Park was tremendous, that the government embarked its own, industrial park development. And we will see, for instance, after the Eastern Industrial Park, the government, started the operation of Bole Lami First Industrial Park around Addis Ababa, which is operating on apparel and textile. And it has started operation. Bole Lami Second also around Addis Ababa again. Bole Lami is on the western side of Addis Ababa. On the eastern side of Addis Ababa. And that is also on textile and the garment. We can also find Kilinto. Kilinto is also next to Bole Lami. That's also around Addis Ababa. The government also started Hawasa Industrial Park development. Hawasa is the most sophisticated and modern industrial park development in Africa. And all these industrial parks were supported by China. The Chinese contractor, took over in building these industrial parks. We have also the Adama Industrial Park, which is also one of the largest. It is on garment, textile, and machinery, which is very closer to the Addis Ababa Djibouti Railway. We have also the Dredwa Industrial Park. We have the Mekelle Industrial Park. We have the Kombolcha Industrial Park. working on apparel and textile. We have Jimma Industrial Park, which is located in Oromia. Adama is also in Oromia. We have also Bahar Dar Industrial Park, which is the capital city of Amhara region. We have also Dabra Brahan Industrial Park, which is working on garment and apparel, which is, I think, 100 kilometers on the western side of Addis. So all these industrial parks are functioning, and all of them were built by Chinese company. So the role of China in supporting and building this industrial park, starting from financing them and bringing Chinese companies is paramount. Even before these industrial parks were embarked, the government sent experts to, some of my friends went there to study the Chinese industrial park development in general for 3 months. It's only after that the government started, working on these industrial parks. In general, what are the, let me go to the next point on opportunities and challenges of industrialization agenda in Ethiopia, including the industrial parks. Indeed, as Lovise highlighted at the beginning of this meeting, there are several opportunities for industrialization as well as industrial park development in Ethiopia. The first one is, the diverse agroecological condition, as the country has a large size and a diverse topography, helps in producing cereals, pulses, oil seeds, fruits, vegetables, among others. Ethiopia is also the largest coffee producers, the third largest producers of Arabic beans in the world. That's also one opportunity. The second opportunity is the country's diverse agroecological condition as a good investment opportunity. Its cheap and abundant labor source manifests this, and availability of easily trainable skilled workforce, lower energy price per unit, relatively political stability against the Horn African countries, rich raw material resources such as livestock, diversified agroecological zones, suitable to grow different kinds of industrial crops such as cotton, and a varieties of tourism products, including wildlife, historical, cultural, also another advantage. The third opportunity is Ethiopia's geographical location is very strategic for international marketing besides its domestic market potential. Ethiopia's proximity to Europe, Asia, and also to the Red Sea is a very strategic point. The fourth advantage is Ethiopia's development strategy is also an opportunity for investment that the Ethiopian government subsequently was trying to attract foreign direct investment, expressing this through policies and also inviting Chinese investors and others to come and invest. And the fifth opportunity, Ethiopia also formulated a clear industrial park development proclamation that also helped to attract investment in industrial parks. The sixth is Ethiopia offers a comprehensive set of physical and non-physical incentives to encourage investment into priority areas, including customs duty exemptions up to 100% of imports of capital goods for eligible area of investment. Depending on the nature of investment and the location in the country, the government provides tax exemption ranging from 1 to 9 years. Loss carry forward for a business that suffers losses during the income tax exemption for half of the tax exemption period. And also, except for a few products, no export tax is levied on Ethiopian export products. Duty drawback scheme, various non-physical incentives for exporters, guaranteed remittance of capital for foreign investors like that. So this also attracted huge investment in Ethiopia. The seventh is Ethiopia is also one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, as said before. That also helped a lot to attract investment in the country. For instance, the country got recognition from UNCTAD for promoting investment in sustainable development goals. The World Bank also recognized the country through it is a Star Reform Award for investment policy reform and promotion. The country has a stable and conducive macroeconomic environment. So this led attractions of investment, young and trainable labor force, 60% of the population is young. And also the wide market in the country, that the country has more than 110 million people, a growing middle class, and a member of Common Market for Eastern Southern Africa, COMESA, comprising 90 member countries, over 400 million people, and also as the seat of the African Union, UNECA, UNDP, and the regional offices, Ethiopia has managed to attract all this investment. The country has been also trying to improve its infrastructure. That also contributed. But the overall industrialization agenda and the industrial parks development is not bereft of challenges. For instance, Ethiopia might need to develop its legal framework further, as the country has, for instance, has only one law with regard to industrial park development. The second point is Ethiopia has also not developed an institutional structure to acquire and adapt to foreign experiences, unlike China and Singapore and others. Third is the issue of regulations is also another challenge that the industrial park development corporation is handling all things, which is creating a problem. The other is inadequate service provision from local public utilities. The government is trying, but still challenged in relation to utilities like water provision, power, wastewater treatment, solid waste disposal, telecommunication, internet services like that. And also there is a problem in relation to tax administrations, tax irregularities, which the details are also written here. Shortage of finance source, especially hard currency, is another challenge. There is a reduced efficiency in logistics also. I participated in some meetings with these investors, and they were complaining about logistics issue, including the Addis Ababa Djibouti railway. There is also challenges in relation to labor relations. In the interest of time, I'm just highlighting it. Skilled and qualified workforce to be fostered. Lack of capacity in domestic firms to supply quality and sufficient inputs for these investors is also another challenge. Okay, beside all these context, challenges, and opportunities, what has been the role of China? That is the main issue. So China and it are the oldest state in the world. I think this to be taken into consideration. So there has been, before centuries, a trade relationship between Ethiopia and China, as some, documents highlight. But after the coming of APRDF, the bilateral relationship between China and Ethiopia has been enhanced because of several reasons, I may say. The first FOCAC was conducted in 2000, and the second was conducted in 2003 in Addis Ababa. And the third was conducted in Beijing in 2006. So Addis Ababa and in general, the role of Ethiopia was very high because after the 2000 FOCAC, which was conducted in Ethiopia, more than 48 heads of state participated in the third FOCAC in 2006. So the Chinese used Ethiopia as a diplomatic entry to reach to the rest of Africa because of the role of Ethiopia in general in the decolonization process in Africa, as well as its role in the formation of the African Union. And still it is, the diplomatic seat of Africa. So since then, we have witnessed a very increased bilateral relationship between Ethiopia and China, because my master's paper was on Ethiopia and China in 2007-8. I got excellent. Since then, I have been publishing and following this trajectory and publishing almost every year. So it has been increased significantly. In general, when we see the role of China in Ethiopia, it has a very strong political relationship, especially with the previous APRDF government, including the current party, that is Prosperity Party. because it's just a continuation of APRDF, except TPLF that doesn't want to join the Prosperity Party and then crashed subsequently. So the bondage between Ethiopia and China politically and diplomatically is very strong. Still, China is defending Ethiopia. If you follow recently at the United Nations, a Security Council meeting with regard to the Tigray issue, which they will, meet again today. The diplomatic and the political relationship between China and Ethiopia is very, very, very strong. In general, we see the role of China in Ethiopia in hard infrastructure such as roads, railways, bridges, energy generation is very high. For instance, if you see in Addis, like more than 90% of the roads were built with help of China. On the other hand, we are
Gedion, in sake of time, because we have another speaker, if you could, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if you could think about condensing your last part of your presentation would be nice.
Yes, yeah, I'm just finalizing. I'm finalizing. As said before, China is also the top trade partner to Ethiopia. China also offered zero tariff policy on agriculture imports, around 400 something products to enter to China market for free. China is also a significant source of manufactured goods and machinery for Ethiopia. Not only this, China also helped Ethiopia for the transfer of technology and the skills because of all these industrial parks, and also which this contributed in job creation, foreign currency payment, technology transfers, and others. Indeed, as you rightly said before, the Chinese companies are exploiting the opportunity provided by AGOA from the US. And through that opportunity, they are exporting to the US market from Ethiopia, as well as the European Union EBA, everything except arms, opportunity to export to Europe. And also, especially the Chinese also has contributed a lot in railway construction, including the Addis Ababa and the light railway in Ethiopia. China also canceled and restructured some of the loans to Ethiopia. China also agreed to restructure some of its loans to Ethiopia, even including recently. So in general, when we see, we will see the big projects financed by China. The Addis Ababa City Electric Service Rehabilitation Project, the Bole Lami Kelinto Industrial Zone, as I said, the Malaz Zenawi Leadership Academy, Kaliti Roundabout, Tuludimtu road projects, the Dredoa road project, several other sugar projects, Bole International Airport Terminal expansion. So we see the high footprint of China in Ethiopia still, even after Abiy Ahmed. Yeah. Some people were saying that after Abiy, the relationship will not continue like that, but I don't think so, because China is already entrenched in Ethiopia. And even to some extent, out of the big loan China offered to African countries, Ethiopia stands second next to Angola. Yeah. So there is a very high entrenched relationship between China and Ethiopia. Finally, why China is doing all these things to Ethiopia? Let me highlight.
Maybe we can get back to this in the question and answer session, because now
possible.
Yes, that would be great. So possible. I think you have addressed a lot of important and interesting issues. I think we will get back to you in the question and answer session. I will now give the word to Nicolas to just get a bit grounded on what goes on in southern Ethiopia with the Hawasa Industrial Park.
Thank you. In awareness of time, I'll try to be quick. Okay, so I guess you can all see my screen. A few preambles before getting to the presentation. My presentation is part of a larger project compared to urbanization in China and in Africa. You see all the sponsors there. It looks like a movie festival with all the sponsors. But this is a was about, and one of the case studies was about Hawasa, and we also have other case studies in other cities in Ethiopia and Kenya. The Hawasa Industrial Park was built by a Chinese state-owned enterprise, CCECC. However, rather than a direct Chinese project in Africa, I think Hawasa is more valuable. It's a case of applied policy emulation, if we see it in that way, because it's in a way, following the Chinese motto of adapting policies to local conditions. It is the industrial park agenda, as was mentioned by the previous panelists. It's inspired by China's experience, but it is adapted to Ethiopia's local political and institutional conditions. And so what I want to highlight here is, in my presentation, there's two main points that I want to highlight. Firstly is how the political situation and the institutional situation shapes the way development strategies in an African country such as Ethiopia are adapted. Despite the Chinese example, these policies are refracted through the lens of local political and institutional conditions. And secondly, and by no means undermining the significant achievements that have been reached by the Ethiopian leadership, I want to also highlight some institutional limits to what can be achieved in pursuing a labor-intensive industrialization strategy. We know China's labor-intensive industrialization model. There was a synergy between urbanization and industrialization. In Africa, as you can see in these charts, in Africa, we have not seen it to the same extent, although comparatively, as you can see here on the right, Ethiopia has done better than most of its African peers in terms of the synchronization of economic growth and urbanization. Sorry, I'm not going to explain, I'm going to be relatively quick here. Despite the significant GDP growth, with Gedion mentioned, and the fact that the country is following a traditional modernization patterns, if we were to believe the urbanization, industrialization figures, we can see from this chart that the percentage of manufacturing jobs in urban areas has actually not increased and has actually fallen slightly over the past 10 years or 15 years. So this is obviously contrasts markedly with the Chinese example. So the question is, why has urbanization in Ethiopia not been accompanied by industrialization? There are many reasons, which I won't get into, but a large has to do with features of institutional and economic environment. In order to overcome this problem, since, as again, the previous panelists mentioned, starting with the Eastern Industry Zone and then Boleleni and so forth, but let's say flourishing, reaching its final stage or more developed stage in Hawasa, the Ethiopian leadership has put in place an ambitious project of industrial park development. And the way it is seen, the logic behind the industrial parks in Ethiopia is very different from the logic that guided industrial park development in China. First of all, we have to bear in mind the huge diversity of special economic zones and technology zones and industrial parks and so forth that were present in China. But in Ethiopia, the industrial parks are seen mainly as a means of overcoming the significant institutional obstacles to industrialization that have plagued previous industrialization, industrial policy efforts. It's also the outcome of a learning process. And so the idea is to bypass all the constraints that Bedeville industrialization by concentrating the government's policy efforts in a demarcated geographical zone. So here on the left, I won't go into details, but I think it's quite well known by the panelists at least. A number of measures were put in place to facilitate these foreign garment enterprises that came to Hawasa Industrial Park. And it's so important also to remember that the lead investor here, although there's a frequent association between China and Ethiopia's industrialization efforts, the park was financed by a Eurobond, $246 million. The lead investor is an American multinational, PVH, which owns Tommy Hilfiger, Calvin Klein, among other brands. And so it cannot be characterized as a Chinese project, although it was constructed by the Chinese and the architecture resembles many Chinese parks, but it's definitely adapted to local circumstances. Okay, so again, I'm rushing a bit, but if maybe in the Q&A we can get into things into more details, because there's a lot of material here. I actually further I want to break down into separate papers. So what has been the effect of the industrial park on the city, right? So I choose in this, in my paper, I choose to look at the relationship between urbanization and industrialization in terms of two directions. On the one hand, there's the effect of the city, of the industrial park on the city. And on the other hand, it has the effect on the city on the industrial park's performance. So here in this chart, which can be a bit confusing, but I will explain, you see the effects of the industrial park on the local housing market. So what all these lines tell you is that the industrial park is likely to have caused a significant increase in housing prices, in rental prices in Hawasa. And the red lines show different inflation measures. And by all accounts, especially before 2019, the housing market, rental prices have increased in real terms, that is above inflation terms. And this increase has been more marked in the lower quartiles of rent, especially between the second and third quartile, the mid quartiles, and which happen to be the ones where industrial park workers tend to live. So this is, industrial park workers tend to pay around 400 or 500 birr per person in order to rent rooms. And this is the sector of the housing market that has been the most affected by an increase in prices. So that is indicative that of a lack of supply response to the increased demand caused by the industrial park. It is estimated that the construction of Hawasa Industrial Park, well, I estimate the construction of Hawasa Industrial Park has increased the rates of immigration towards Hawasa by around 60%. So, it has created a significant change in the local housing market. Another consequence of this increased migration into Hawasa is the acceleration of the process of so-called peri-urbanization. That is, the expansion of the cities, of the built-up area at the fringes of the city in a way that is informal and unplanned. And this has very detrimental effects for subsequent urban development, because it means the city grows in an unplanned way. There's no infrastructure, no facilities in the areas where the city is growing, which happen to be the areas where most of the industrial park workers go to live. So what you can see in this chart, where you can see in this figure, is expansion of the built-up area in Hawasa. And you can see between this, I think maybe you cannot see it, maybe now you can see it better. This is on the right-hand side. It's the last one is 2011. And this has only kept increasing since. It's been 10 years now. And this has massively increased. So it is a real problem, which comes with all kinds of negative side effects. One of which is the fact, and I'll get into it later in the presentation when I compare the Ethiopian situation to that in China, is the fact that the rise in land and housing prices derived from the increase of demand do not get directed into investment in the way they would otherwise be. Partly because a lot of these rising land rents go into the hand of informal brokers and not the state, and because the financial infrastructure is not there to direct these extra funds into industrial development. But I'll get into it when I compare to China. One of the negative side effects of the lack of housing for industrial park workers is the increase in turnover that this generates. So here are some quotes. On the left-hand side, we have some quotes from some NGOs and universities who have done studies on Hawasa and the housing situation. And this is a really serious issue, and it has a really detrimental impact on worker welfare. In the paper, I examine in greater depth what exactly the causal mechanism linking rising house prices and industrial performance are, labor productivity, more precisely. But here you have some information, from some surveys, one from the World Bank, which shows that even compared to Bolelemi Industrial Park in Addis, in Hawasa, there's a greater incidence of workers moving because rental prices have increased. So this is the dark gray bar here in the bottom chart. This is a more serious issue in Hawasa even than in Addis. And we know that housing instability can have very, very detrimental psychological impacts that then have an impact on labor productivity. On the bottom, we have the findings from another survey by some colleagues at Oxford and the former Ethiopian Development Research Institute. And you can see when workers are asked why they have left their jobs, the number one reason is that their money, that their wages are not high enough. Over 60% cite that as a reason for leaving their job, right? So obviously high rent prices have direct consequences on the real purchasing power of these workers. And so both in terms of through different mechanisms, that we have reason to believe that badly functioning housing market is having a detrimental impact on labor productivity and also on worker welfare in Hawasa. However, we can also look at, so we've looked at the event, so now we're looking at the effect of the city on the industrial park, right? And I have highlighted this high rising housing prices mechanism and the detrimental effect it has on labor productivity. One of the things that I argue in the paper that I gave after this presentation is that also, despite people who have been involved, maybe Lovise has, she's aware of this, people have been involved in discussing the situation in Hawasa. There's a frequent, people frequently mention this housing problem as, being the main issue that is affecting labor productivity and worker welfare in Hawasa. But one exercise that I tried doing in the paper with the available data, so it's somewhat impressionistic, I tried to quantify the impact of the housing issue on the labor turnover question. And what I have in this chart here, I compare the trajectories of workers and after they leave Hawasa based on different surveys and the reasons they have to leave. And what I try to do through this, a very preliminary exercise, is quantify two channels for looking at labor turnover. One of them is the extent to which jobs in the city are to be preferred to jobs in the countryside, right? And this is what you see on the right-hand side. And I won't get into depth here, but it's the idea that by having higher housing prices, you have lower purchasing power in the city, and that makes jobs in the city less attractive vis-a-vis jobs in the countryside. So that is one mechanism through which a badly functioning urban environment can affect labor turnover. Because a lot of these workers, they come to the city, disappointed with what they see, they return to the countryside. And that is a frequent source of labor turnover. However, I argue that this is not the end all and be all of the industrialization issues that are met in Ethiopia. So there's another channel, and that is the issue of the relative preferability of manufacturing jobs versus service jobs in urban areas of Ethiopia. This has been a subject of research. There's a famous paper by Chris Blattman and Stefan Durkon who have written on this. And recurrently, most research finds that when given the choice, workers prefer to work in the service sector or in self-employment rather than working in manufacturing, right? So this idea of forming this industrial proletariat and industrialization, and that doesn't happen. This kind of class formation, it doesn't take place in Ethiopia because workers use the manufacturing jobs simply as a stepping stone for their next steps. And so I try to frame it in these two problems. I call them problems of industrialization, and I'll get into this in more depth in subsequent studies. And here we can see there have been some policy initiatives trying to ameliorate the housing situation in Hawasa. I won't get into depth in them. One was a Sedama microfinance scheme. The other was a dormitory housing that the IPDC and investors have tried developing in Hawasa. But I argue that both schemes, both policies incur the same problems, right? And that is they inevitably have to make recourse to subsidization. They have to subsidize housing development. And the solution that they encounter end up not being sustainable. So in the Sedama microfinance scheme, it's a subsidized loan scheme. So that requires, at the end of the day, it's a central government that subsidizes these loan schemes. And the same with dormitory housing. The central government subsidizes dormitory housing through allocation of land. So especially dormitory housing is more well developed now. There have been recent progress since for the past year when I last conducted fieldwork. So what I argue is that this is and again, I can get into the greater depth, this is a feature of the model of industrial development that has been adopted in Ethiopia. So because of the centralized solutions to the problems of industrialization, which is a stark contrast with the solutions adopted in China, it means that there is no underlying financial rationale to tackle the problems that arise. I'll get into that in a couple of slides into this problem. Sorry if I'm rushing a bit. But here I think it's interesting to stop. And since we're talking about this presentation as a case of applied policy emulation, which Hawasa is, I think, and I get into much more depth into this in the paper, comparing there's a similar model in Ethiopia. It's a labor-intensive industrialization model based on migrant labor. Ethiopia and China has actually similar institutional frameworks, right? In both countries, all land is owned by the state, and privates can only lease land and not have a freehold land rights. However, if we look at how the problems, so again, the city versus countryside and the manufacturing versus services problems, how they were tackled in China, we can see the institutional structure underpinning Chinese industrialization is very different. On the one hand, you have this phenomenon of so-called urban villages, right? And these are communes that, as cities expanded, they retained their rights to residential housing. Although they most often they sold their farming land to expand in cities, these are communes that retain their urban their land rights. And so these were fundamental parts of Chinese industrialization, because most of the migrant workers who came to Chinese cities were housed in these urban villages. And a lot of the urban villagers who used to be farmers or fishers or whatever, they actually changed their livelihood strategies and became landowners. And the fundamental difference here with the Ethiopian situation is that rather than having these cities expand in an uncontrolled fashion, so this peri-urbanization, the rents derived through increasing urbanization in China were deployed to housing the workers. And they were not dispersed in this unplanned Chinese or Ethiopian urbanization pattern. And so I argue that this helped ameliorate this city versus countryside issue, because it decreased housing prices, gave workers housing very close to their workplaces, and was a component in China's low labor cost industrialization model. Another component of Chinese migrant-based urbanization was dormitory housing, which again is one of the solutions. This has a clear parallel to the solutions being advocated in Ethiopia, which are dormitory housing and subsidized loan schemes. But a reading of the Chinese experience, and I really recommend going to this because it's very interesting once you look at it. Dormitory housing were not only used as a means of providing housing to workers in urban areas, but they're also often a means of labor control. This is a less palatable side of Chinese urbanization, but in many cases, there were some significant restrictions on workers' freedoms. The dormitory housing was a way through which employers were able to exert significant control over workers' time use. There's an important gender dimension here, as workers were mostly females. And there's a whole literature on how in this East Asian industrialization, the use of local gender norms contributed to extracting, to use a very Marxist language, to extract the surplus from these workers. And again, going back to the problem of manufacturing versus services and city versus countryside, this dormitory housing, the Chinese industrialization experience, was an important way of, and also social norms around the desirability of different occupations, was an important way of ensuring that industrial manufacturing enterprises had an adequate labor supply.
So Nicolas?
So information here. Sorry, I'm running out of
time is also flying for you. So yeah, so we have about 20 minutes left of the whole webinar. So it would be nice to have some time for questions and answers as well.
Let me make this my last slide. So in conclusion, so there's a lot of information here, but in conclusion, the message I want to pass on is you cannot adopt a similar model in the case of Ethiopia based on this kind of big push, industrialization, urbanization, and how different processes will respond and come in hand. But what I argue is that lacking an adequate institutional structure and that was the institutional structure that was in place in China at the onset of reforms, the impulse created by urban industrialization would not have this kind of a evolution that pushed Chinese development, right? So you have industrialization, but then the rest of the institutional environment does not allow actors to adapt to what is going on, and so the industrialization becomes unsustainable. And I think that is one of the key issues that needs to be brought to the agenda, and I can discuss more in the Q&A when discussing the models being adopted in Ethiopia and other African countries, is how the institutional structure being different from China, the effects of infrastructure and industrial project driven development will be very different. Okay, so I have some policy implications, but I think that is it.
Thank you.
Sorry if I had to rush.
Yeah, but that's life. It's a short webinar altogether, and we have many speakers. Thank you very much. I think I would like to open the floor for the other panelists also if you have questions or comments on the others' presentations, that would be great to hear. It's very interesting what you pointed out, Nicolas, in your presentation, that when you compare the industrialization of Ethiopia and China, it's actually more centralized in Ethiopia than in China, which is contrary to what many people would expect, because one of the issues that was discussed when the first industrial park was established in Ethiopia, the Eastern Industrial Zone, that was a Chinese park, was that there was some lack of coordination between the central government and the regional governments, that is Oromia, where the park is located. And also it's been a complaint from Chinese investors in Ethiopia that the regional governments have not been very hospitable towards industrialization, and there've been lack of coordination between the two levels. And that could also be a challenge in the future because of, now the central government is, whatever you would like to, what kind of views you have on the current political situation. I think it's fair to say that the central government in Addis Ababa now is weaker than it used to be. That would probably have an impact on the prospects of industrial relations in Ethiopia in the future. But would you like to comment on this argument that Nicolas had about Ethiopia being more centralized in industrial policy than China? It's an interesting observation. Now you have to unmute.
I think I think this is a very interesting observation. I think it's China, in a way, we call it it's a unitary state, a constitutionally unitary state, but I think it's a fiscal federalism, as many would actually call it. So I think it's one of the key factors that actually contribute to China's economic development is actually really have a fiscal decentralization, which is allow those local governments to really play developmental roles to promote economic development. Establishing those special economic zones, I think that was the examples that which was proved as being quite effective, successful. But I think in the case of the Ethiopia, I think it's all the industrial parks and special economic zones was governed by IPDC, which I think has little coordination with the local governments. When we visited Ethiopia, we also, I think it's pointed out, this actually was one of the key things, concerns that could actually affect their sustainability of those industrial parks. So I think that's the one thing I think I agree with Nicolas. I think there's another point I would like to also to make. It's about what he said about those labor intensive manufacturing, which I pointed out in my lecture, that I think this is actually Ethiopia won't be able to replicate what China have been doing to develop those labor intensive manufacturing. I think not just, I think is what Nicolas pointed out, the reason of the labor cost and the housing issue is it's one thing, but I think it's another thing is actually, if you look at from the macro perspective, the level of the capital intensity, all the technology has been used in this Ethiopia was actually unusually high. I think that's relatively speaking. I think this is actually a recent study shows that because I think that's, they have been dragged to using, the technology which has been used by other countries because they have to be, has to kind of like engage in this, global value chain. So I think that's probably was another factor. I don't know how that's, maybe we didn't see that but I think that's could also provide another explanations why this, the labor-intensive manufacturing may not be the, the only options for Ethiopia, right? Because I think that's it already start to kind of like try to build up this, the service sectors, which is based on this in the, some manufacturing. So yeah, that's just my point.
Yes, Gedion, you talked about the relationship between Ethiopia and China, and you argue that it's still a very strong relationship between the two countries, even if there have been political changes in Ethiopia. One of the interesting observations I've made lately is that one of the most important technocrats in the development of industrial policy in Ethiopia, Arkebe Okubai, is now the official candidate for becoming, for leading the UN Organization on Industrial Development, UNIDO. Mm-hmm. And it's been interesting to see how he, being a former member of the TPLF and from the region, which now the central government is waging a war against, has managed to remain as a sort of non-political technocrat in this situation, which of course is indicating that there could be a continuation more than a disruption of this policy. But I'm not sure if you have any more comments on this, Gedion. What are the implications of the political crisis that is unfolding in Ethiopia at the moment on the relationship to China and Ethiopia, and also the general atmosphere of investments and industrialization in Ethiopia?
I think it is important to understand the context why this crisis created between TPLF and APRDF. Prosperity Party, I mean, because EPRF is already dismantled. Because look, Abiy came up with a policy that one party must be created. Previously, as you know, and also well written on it, on Ethiopian federal system, the four parties were prominent, mainly led by TPLF, that is the Tigrayan Liberation Front, followed by the Oromo Democratic Front, the South, as well as Andam Zamara. But subsequently, after the days of Mallas, the power was shifted, especially after Haile Mariam left, because there was a persistent uprising on the policies of APRDF. So Abiy Ahmed came from the Oromia region, as you know. So Abiy came up with a policy that we need to form one party. We shouldn't continue as a four-party forming APRDF. Rather, we need to form a prosperity party, rebranding itself. Because as you know, the peripheral regions, Afar, Somali, Benishangul, Gambela, Harari were not part of the APRDF. So he said they must be part of the APRDF. In that regard, we shouldn't continue as APRDF. We need to continue as one party, as opposition party, as a prosperity party, PP. So the Tigray Liberation Front didn't agree with this suggestion. So they didn't join, which he said, okay, if you don't want to continue, you can continue as you are. Maybe you can be even opposition party. He said, no problem. But the problem created when the election was postponed because of COVID, which is a national electoral board led by Burtukan, she said, because of COVID, we are unable to continue this election. So the election was postponed, but TPLF continued and conducted the election in the beginning of September without the recognition of the electoral board. So because of that, there was a budget cut from the central government. Even Abiy sent, elderly people to reconcile with them, trying to, but it was, I think, ideological problem that they don't want to continue with the Prosperity Party. Subsequently, they also attacked the national defense, which is in Tigray region. So that's why all this, problem created. So indeed, one of the factors that contributed for the enhancement of relation between China and Ethiopia was the ideological affinity between APRDF, which has a socialist tendency, and also the Chinese Communist Party, and backed by the 2005 election crisis and the subsequent shift of Ethiopia from Western countries to China. But still, my argument is that, there is a heavy Chinese presence in Ethiopia at the moment. You see, in all these industrial parks, you see Chinese investors. Not only that, our traders virtually are bringing goods from China. You see daily flights to all the major cities in China. So the development assistance is also still continuing. For example, if you see the sugar beautifying project, beautifying Addis Ababa, that project is Abiy's project. It was supported by China. And even other major projects that Abiy is coming up is still supported by China. So we can't say that China is retreating from Ethiopia. Rather, it is, still a strong relationship exists between Ethiopia and China, because the background, we need to see the context that there is a high presence of China in Ethiopia in terms of trade relationship, in terms of political, as I said before, diplomatic relationship, in terms of investment, in terms of, again, loan and grants and some other support and scholarship still. Even after Abiy came, several government officials were sent through the scholarship offered by China. I was invited in that, sending program. So because of all this, still the relationship is, enhanced. In major decisions, China is still supporting Ethiopia, including the peace operation that the government say now it's a peacekeeping law enforcement operation in Tigray region, not war per se. So which China also supported that.
Yes, yes. So it means in a way that there are a lot of the projects and the investments that China has done in Ethiopia is not just easily withdrawn in a minute because of political change. And maybe, it's also interesting to hear what Nicolas and you is thinking about, how important is politics and political affiliation or affinity with the regimes that China is investing and aiding. As I mentioned in the beginning, Ethiopia was not originally a kind of traditionally attractive partner because it doesn't have their natural resource and a coast. So would politics actually, does it play a role at all in the choice of Ethiopia as a partner?
Yes, indeed.
So would you like to say, and yes.
Yeah, I think it's yes, I think this, so like both from this, this kind of like a tradition, this kind of long-term, this legacy. I think is Ethiopia is it's always a partner. It's a good partner with China. I think it's from the political and economic reasons. I think that Ethiopia is because it's China would very like to see Ethiopia's economic development to be a successful, example, right? Which I think as you mentioned, I think Ethiopia is like adopted like a developmental state model, which I think is very much like this East Asian stories. So I think if this could be something which proved to be successful, I think this actually would also inspire some other African countries, to do the same. I think this is something which I think is China and would really like to see that this could be, this type of the, state-led, growth model would actually be not only successful, but also could be, replicated, in other parts of the world. I think that's the, something which I think it's certainly was of the China's interest. Yeah.
So Nicolas, when you have been looking at Hawasa, particularly as a case of this policy, I mean, you have indicated that there are challenges. So if you're going to kind of give a broad assessment of the future of these kind of projects and industrialization in Ethiopia, what would you say? I mean, there is optimism among the others, and you share that.
I think it's very hard to tell at the moment because we've been so distracted by other news coming from Ethiopia. Certainly, the industrialization agenda has lost some of the level of rhetorical centrality that it had before the arrival of Abiy to power. Still, the industrial park agenda is ongoing. You see activities. The policy officials are there. It is part of the newly reviewed 10-year plan. It's not a central part, but it is a part of the plan, and it is mentioned. With regard to the industrial parks, it seems that there is some attention, perhaps not as much as before, because perhaps its main policy entrepreneur, as you mentioned, Dr. Arkebe, he's moving elsewhere. With regard to industrialization of Ethiopia, I think we need to make a distinction between industrialization through integration in global value chains and the kind of import substitution industrialization that most Chinese enterprises, in fact, engage in, and most enterprises in Ethiopia engage in, right? So the GVC model, it's not evident if it will be successful. Probably in the short term, import substitution industrialization will make more progress, but it's hard to tell.
Yes, it is absolutely difficult to tell the future. We are approaching the end of the seminar. I think we have touched upon a lot of interesting issues and trends and patterns, and many of them would also probably be relevant for the next seminars that we are going to have in this series. So I hope the panelists and the other audiences would follow the next seminar, which is next week, I think, that will address the debt crisis. And Ethiopia is one of those countries that has huge debts to China. And it would be interesting to know more about the processes of refinancing that has been particularly important after the COVID crisis. So I'm very grateful for your participation today. It's been a privilege to listen to your analysis. And thank you to the audience that's been following this. The seminar is recorded, so it will be available on YouTube. You can get the link, I think, on Bergen Global's pages. So thank you very much, everybody, and bye for now.